Thank you. Bonjour tout le monde. On va commencer dans...
Hello, everyone. We will start shortly. I'm going to let people in now.
Donc, je pense que en attendant que les retardataires arrivent, je vais pouvoir commencer rapidement l'introduction.
I will start my introduction. We have many guests today. As a quick reminder, this eMag is translated both into French and English. You can click at the bottom of your screen on the globe icon.
You can click on the globe icon on the bottom right of your screen and select your language. Donc, pour rappel, merci de garder vos micros.
Please keep your mic on muted at all times unless you are speaking. You can also use the chat for sending questions. You can also rename yourself with the name of your organization, which could be helpful for everyone to know. So hello, everyone. For this eMag on sustainable building and construction in Africa, we will be focusing on access to finance in this sector. We are organizing this session with the World Building Council, Green Building Council, who is in charge of Afrik 21, who will be moderating this session. We are also in partnership with Afrik 21, with Jean-Marie Takouleu, who is the chief editor, who will do a review just after this introduction. I'm now going to quickly show you a first slide. And then we can get started. First of all, we will have a press review from Jean-Marie Takouleu, editor-in-chief for Afrik 21. Then we will have, after the press review, we will have an introduction. We'll be listening to Vere Shaba. She'll be leading the session. She's the head of Africa program at the World Green Council, Building Council. Then we will talk about access to finance in the building sector for private and non-state actors. We will be hearing from a green building specialist. In the Ivory Coast is a bank holiday today, and so we appreciate him being with us today. Then we will have John Kalungi Kabuye, who is the CEO of BESIC Group and Finance and Infrastructure Advisor of Kenya GBS. He will be talking about accessing climate fund for building and construction projects. And we'll be listening to his advice when it comes to building and construction. And to close this panel, we have Tony Lee Luen, who is the founder of the GBC Mauritius and partner of Ecosis, who will be also sharing his experience regarding adaptation and resilience in an island context, especially in the case of Mauritius Island. He will be sharing also an important message regarding the COP27. At the end of these presentations, we will take a few minutes to answer questions and to share with the audience. So if you want to send some questions or comments, you can use the chat box and we will do our best to get back to you. Wishing you a good eMag session. And I'm now going to be starting with our first speaker, Jean-Marie Takouleu, who is the head of the Afrik 21. He will be talking about the activity in this field of construction. Jean-Marie, you have the floor, and you can share with us what draw your attention lately regarding sustainable building and construction. You have the floor. Hello, everyone. As you've mentioned it, in the area of sustainable building and construction in Africa, at the moment, we are, of course, busy with implementing access to finance for sustainable development. The various mechanisms which have been implemented so far, we have what we call the green bond or green obligations, which mean that the banks have to mobilize funds in order to finance various green projects or to lend to building developers. The last transaction was recorded just a few weeks ago in Namibia, where the First National Bank, which is the commercial bank of the National Bank of South Africa, had this green obligation in order to mobilize $4 million. And the fruit of this transaction was to lend microcredits to construction developers and building developers for sustainable development and building and construction in a country where droughts are recurrent and the weather is very dry. We have to build buildings respecting, of course, these norms and these circumstances and conditions. Also recently, and this has speeded up lately, in South Africa mainly, we have recorded another negotiation with the Net Bank involved in renewable energies and water management. This operation with the green obligation went to the stock exchange at Johannesburg in order to mobilize $120 million in order to finance various development projects, especially in the area of building and construction, sustainable building and construction. The most recent news in this field, in the sector, is a mobilization of companies or funders, international funders, especially the Financial International Society, SFI, which is in charge of financing the private sector. I think they approved the loan just a few days ago. They approved this loan for $140 million for a partner. They are financing SMEs specialized in sustainable building construction in South Africa. So among these partners or among these investors who are supporting sustainable building and construction, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Green Development is one of them and is focusing mainly in Northern Africa. Recently, a loan of $50 million dedicated to a local bank, an Egyptian subsidy of the National Bank. The purpose, again, is to finance green buildings in Egypt and to support a project of the new capital, the new administrative capital in Egypt that should contain several such projects, green projects as such, that would be using renewable energies. Another very active society in the coming months. The ex-CDC group also released some funding in two countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Kenya. First of all, $48 million for building 10,000 green buildings, houses. And in South Africa as well, they they gave a loan to the University Bank for building over 200,000 housing units in Johannesburg. So what we're seeing here is a dynamic in the access to finance for green building. What we're seeing now a certification of some of those buildings since 2021, of course, with the COVID crisis. And obviously, some investors and builders became more aware of the necessity to protect the environment. The Green Building South Africa alone for the year 2021 recorded 140 certification of green buildings based on 3 criteria. And people here probably could tell more about this. The Niger Water Performance, the Green Star, Excellence in Design for Green Efficiency from the International Financial Society, which our guests could talk more about here. But a few months ago also, another certification, a hotel in Douala, which was rewarded with this certification, taking into account the energy efficiency and the implementation of low energy devices and schemes, also water management and waste management. Recently, we have also observed various movements for certification, which have expanded to other countries in West Africa, in Ghana, and the SFI continues to expand the certification to other countries. The idea, of course, is to continue to encourage the building of green constructions in a context affected by climate change. The other problem, I don't know if we should call it a problem, or another issue or phenomena in Africa, of course, is the demographic growth, which of course is requiring more and more constructions in cities in order to welcome the growing population. Other companies, we do not want to simply build green buildings, but we also want to also offer low carbon equipment. Just to give you an example, in Ghana, for example, where they are developing a technology to replace some material by low carbon materials for cement. This is something that is quite difficult because it requires a lot of shipping. So the project there in Ghana was to replace that particular material by argile that is collected there in Ghana to save on shipping costs. This is a very innovative project which got the support of several investors and some funds from Denmark and from nowhere as well, from the government funds. Just to conclude, Chloe, we should also say that the sustainable building and constructions will be at the heart of some main gatherings, mainly at COP27 next November. And this topic will also be tackled during the Afrik City Summit, focusing on the intermediate cities, which will take place in May. And that's it for me, Chloe. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for giving us some hot news in the field of sustainable building and construction, especially access to finance in Africa. Without further ado, I will now give the floor to our next speakers.
Roundup of the news that's happening. And hi to every person who's in the room right now. I know some of you were introducing yourself, which is great because we get to know which countries you're from, but it would be great if you could, in the chat, introduce yourselves, say what countries you're from. I see that there's Ghana, there's Nigeria, there's Senegal. So it's really great to get to know every single one of you. So I'm the head of Africa programs of the World Green Building Council, and the World Green Building Council Africa Regional Network represents 10 green building councils across the continent that just focuses on sustainable buildings and construction, or in my French is bad, but bâtiment construction durable. And so I think what we'll do today is really unpack some of what Jean-Marie was talking about on the ground, and we have some amazing speakers who will really speak into it from a climate finance perspective. So we've got Conrad who will speak about that. And then we've got John who's going to speak about active projects that are happening in Kenya, where they have been able to access climate finance by really looking at sustainable buildings and construction. And then we'll have Tony who will speak about it from the perspective of small island developing states, because we talk about climate change a lot. We talk about buildings a lot. But what happens when you're actively at the front line watching as the climate is changing your country, and how do we adapt to it? And what are some of the topics going into COP27? Because I think this is one of the first of many really important discussions that center the sustainable buildings and construction in the conversation around climate. So I'll speak a little bit about IPCC, but I want to give more time for our speakers, as well as for you to be able to ask any questions as we go along. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. But I'll just put in the chat just a link to an article that we had recently done that speaks about IPCC's report that came out. And the IPCC basically speaks about climate change and what we need to be prioritizing when it comes to that. And I think the answer that we have as Africa, and when we look at the built environment, is that it really is now or never. When it comes to buildings, they contribute 40% of the emissions that have an impact on climate change. And I think that when we look at some of the three main things that we would love to see more of when it comes to the built environment, it's trying to see how we can get more building codes, really ambitious ones that look at minimizing carbon from how we build, as well as how we use our buildings. And also, I think that what's important is deep collaboration. So every person in this room, whichever country you are in, really collaborating well. And this is where some of our green building councils come along as well, because they are constantly looking at how can we collaborate more when it comes to buildings. And I think communicating it with government, with industry, really having those conversations, because it really is now or never when it comes to addressing climate change, and buildings and sustainable buildings and construction is a critical climate solution. So with that, I think I'll hand over to Conrad. So just a bit of an introduction. Conrad Sanama is a green building specialist at the International Finance Corporation. And we'd really love him to speak a little bit more in our investment and finance segment about how IFC is supporting African non-state actors in the transition to green building practice. So Conrad, how are you?
Oh, I'm good, thank you, Vere. It's good to be here. Thank you for everyone to participate in this event. I guess I should take it in French because I heard the audience was mostly francophone.
Absolutely. And so I think I'll hand over to you. And I think the question that we really have for you is, how is IFC, you're part of the World Bank Group. How are you supporting African non-state actors in the transition towards green buildings? And what does this support look like over the last few years?
Oh, great. Quick question. Juste pour dire la question, Vere,
Indeed, a good question. We will focus on different angles. The IFS, which is the secular member in charge of bilateral relations with the private sector, IFS started a few years ago a certification system, excellence in design for greater efficiency. This program is a certification. It's also a software, also a concept, a tool to help for certification. Who decides who is going to be certified in the area of building and construction, especially green building? We have several layers of people and several steps. The institutional layer, construction developers in agreement with financial facilities and investors which provide for the funds, and professionals of the building sector, architects, technicians, and various technicians. So all these people gather to be able to look at the proposals and to deliver certifications to make sure that this is decarbonized, to reduce also the carbon print as much as possible. What do we do then? We collaborate with this chain of actors, bankers, investment funds, etc., and all the owners, etc. At the institutional level, we do capacity building, training, information, sharing of best practices, and construction codes, sharing construction codes. These codes exist in most of our countries, especially in the French-speaking countries, but often they are not implemented or they are not strengthened. We want to be working in close collaboration to reinforce these construction codes and to encourage the builders, promoters, in order to build better buildings, talking about private houses, social buildings, institutional buildings for middle class. We're talking about hotel as well, hospitals, warehouses, places for storing. So institutions, governments have to be trained, have their capacity built up, working together with the IFS to encourage all these actors, developers, to better build while respecting norms and regulations and keep the ecosystem in place, which is controlled or overseen by the state. So the developers should be able to turn toward this kind of construction. It's becoming more and more demanded. when we talk about financial support, we're talking about investment funds, banks, all these actors which are able to release the finances in order for the developers to build those projects, green projects, in order to get the certification. We also work in close collaboration with financial facilities, with those companies or facilities. Here we're talking more about capacity building. What do I mean by capacity building? I'm talking here about training staff, informing people, staff mainly, and to also allow for work platforms. For example, if one particular department is in charge of the finances or housing, then we turn to these people. We already have a platform which is both in French and English, where we would find tools and elements there that would help to better tackle the issue for green building and construction. So that's what I mean by capacity building. That's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, I'm not so much in charge of this other aspect, but here we also have the device to access new forms of funding for building. So promoters, developers, bankers, with the support of the IFS, we have, and we encourage a number of customers. Could be just a simple house or a whole building of different kinds, buildings of different kinds, hotels with a restaurant or private flats. So we encourage everyone to be able to access or to implement or to seek for that EDGE, the EDGE certification, as I was saying earlier on. Why is it important? During the process, the certification process, the technical team, the professional teams would have the opportunity to adjust their design, their concept, to upgrade it, upscale it, to make sure that it would be less energy consuming along the way, or to consume less water, or to even reduce the carbon print of the building. So this EDGE certification is based on three main measures: reducing energy consumption, reducing water consumption, and reducing energy consumption within the actual materials used for the building. For example, we're talking about some materials, as was said earlier on in Ghana. If you use materials that come from far, you have to use energy, you have to use shipping, and you produce more gas emissions, and therefore you increase your carbon print. So the purpose is to be able to use more local materials with low carbon print in order to have a more efficient building at the end of the day. EDGE relies on the three aspects, and the certification is actually used nowadays by even financial buildings, could be commercial buildings. Je suis sûre qu'on pourra en parler pendant très longtemps, mais malheureusement, nous devons couper court.
But I think just to kind of quickly kind of summarize what you're saying, so there's access to finance simply by being able to have Edge. There are, there's collaboration happening with all the different financial institutes, but you're saying that it's currently not being implemented. Maybe in like 1 minute, just to kind of sum it up, what would you say those barriers are that are stopping it from being implemented in terms of being able to do green buildings? And then from there, we'll kind of go to John to speak about some projects that have implemented, principles that have gotten green financing. So just in about 60 seconds, I might have to time you for this one. So
wait, no problem there. Donc, quelles sont les barrières?
What are the barriers there for institutional barriers, mainly, I would say, and change of habits, our old habits in terms of using traditional material for building. And I'm talking also about the construction codes. Once all this is established, I think we will be able to find better finances and things will be done in a more organic way, in a more natural way once this is established. At the IFS in the French-speaking Africa, in Senegal, Burkina, Cameroon, we follow and we support our customers from beginning to end, and we are very, very much available for that.
We don't have enough time, but awesome. No, thank you for that. And I think, as we said, if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the chat box. And if there are any questions, especially for you, Conrad, we'll be sure to send those through to you. So thank you, Conrad.
Thank you. J'ai laissé mon email dans le chat, donc tout le monde peut me contacter.
Yes,
you have my email in the chat, so you can contact me directly if you want to.
Let's kind of go from what Conrad said. So he said there is access to green finance if you build green, if you build sustainably. And earlier on, Jean-Marie really emphasized that there's a lot going on across the continent when it comes to green buildings. And we emphasize that according to the IPCC report, knowing that Africa is the most impacted when it comes to climate change, how we build matters. So sustainable construction matters. So our next guest is John. I always struggle with the surname, John, but I'm almost there. John Kalungi Kabuye. And he is the CEO of BESIC Group. And also he does quite a lot of advisory around finance, around infrastructure to the Kenya Green Building Society. So based in Kenya, John, kind of building on from what Conrad had said. Can you maybe share with us some of your feedback on accessing climate finance when it comes to buildings and construction projects in Africa?
Hi, Vere. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and good afternoon to each and every person who is actually on this call listening. As introduced, I'm John Kabuye. I'm actually going to speak from two fronts. Number one, I'm actually going to speak in my capacity as a private consultant who's been involved in facilitating and making sure that we get green buildings. What were the challenges? What were the barriers to accessing finance? And also in my previous capacity where I was the Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya Green Building Society, where I had access to numerous projects and understanding how these projects really had to navigate a lot of our difficulties or challenges to be able to access climate finance. Now, first and foremost, I think the word climate finance might be a bit familiar to most of us. Well, to my understanding, climate finance or green finance is basically could be private finance, could be public finance, or could be any form of finance, as long as it's directed or geared towards projects which are very instrumental in addressing climate change and solving environmental degradation, and at the same time also creating economic opportunities for the communities where those projects are actually implemented. Now, that being the case, private finance could be in the form of loans, could be in the form of bonds, could be in the form of impact investors really investing their money into a project which they feel will address a lot of our climate issues. In Kenya, what I can say is that we've had numerous projects which have been able to access this finance. And by being able to access this finance, they had to meet certain requirements or certain conditions to be able to access it. The question number one was that how green or how sustainable are the projects which require this kind of finance? And most of the time, you'll find that a lot of our projects really didn't meet that particular standard. And how do you know whether you meet that particular standard or not? Most of the countries around the world now have made their NDC, have filed their NDCs, their nationally determined contribution towards climate change. So if that's the case, you must make sure that your project at least is able to address a lot of these NDC challenges, because if the NDCs are really stringent and your project is actually not meeting them, that means as far as your project is concerned in that particular country, is actually not green enough and it will really struggle to access climate finance. So that also being the case in Kenya, what happened is that most of the projects which were eventually certified had to make sure that they meet the green building rating systems that we've been talking about and which you had Conrad talk about and Jean-Marie, because with these particular standards, at least you are able to demonstrate to the funders that actually your project meets the minimum climatic conditions, and for that purpose, it actually qualifies to be funded. And that's what most of the projects actually did here in Kenya. What we did is that we used the international rating tools. The first one that came into the Kenyan market was the LEED tool, LEED standing for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And through that tool, because in Kenya, I'm afraid to say is that we are still running on a 1968 building code, and it's really outdated. It cannot be able to drive us in the right direction, and it cannot help us to have the built environment that meets the climate finance requirements or green bond requirements. So that's why we had to rely on the green building rating systems like LEED, IFC Edge, and you will discover that most of these projects in Kenya actually meet those standards. And it's through meeting those standards, that's how they were able to access climate finance. For instance, one of the forms of climate finance is green bonds. I'm sure most of you have heard about climate bonds and green bonds. You'll find that the first green bond, which was launched in Kenya, actually went towards purpose-built student accommodation. So this was a green building, which was actually certified to the IFC Green Building Standard. So it's the IFC Green Building Standard which proved that this building actually met the climate finance requirements, and by that it was able to access climate finance. So that's just one of them. The first buildings which were built green in Kenya were financed by the CDC group, and one of them was it was a Green Star Mall, and of course, and also residential accommodation. But these two developments, the mall and the residential developments, had to meet the minimum standards. They actually had to meet Green Star, Green Star, Africa, Kenya, or they had to meet LEED. So the residential went for a Green Star, but the mall went for LEED. And they were able to access this finance because the financiers do believe that they are able to, those buildings actually meet the required standards. So by that, you see that the standards really helped access climate finance. And then the other thing that I need to tell you about is that as much as the building meets climate finance, it also has to make a good business case. So in other words, unless you're targeting impact investors, but if you're targeting commercial loans or you're targeting bonds, it has to make a business case. But the beauty about green buildings is that they always make business sense. And that's the beauty of it, because all the developments which we have in Kenya all meet those particular requirements. So what I can say, Vere, is that it's very easy for the buildings to actually be able to access finance, and that's how they were able to do it. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And I think that, it's so interesting how, earlier on, Jean-Marie started and said that there is activity. When we talk about sustainable buildings and construction across our continent, it is happening. And then Conrad has spoken about how there is climate finance, and you're just reiterating that there are projects across our continent that have been able to access this green finance for buildings because they're going according to standards that are internationally recognized. So I think that that's really, helpful in terms of the experience feedback. And I think just in the last 2 minutes or so that we have for this experience feedback segment, what advice would you have then for people on this call now to be able to access this green finance from your perspective as a practitioner? So Conrad's kind of really laid out that this is what's possible, this is what's achievable. What would you say, what advice would you give for people who want to access this green finance through building and construction or sustainable building and construction?
I think anybody who wants to access climate finance needs to be very intentional with the aspirations and goals of developing green and making sure that their buildings are actually sustainable. With that goal in mind, it's easy to set your targets. And once you set your targets, because your targets can actually even be net zero targets, which is very ideal, and it's actually very doable. And that way, once you target very good ambition, your chances of actually accessing finance are even much more higher compared to somebody else who has lower ambitions. So my first take will always be set your ambitions high, plan accordingly, and once you plan accordingly, try to make sure that you build or develop something to those particular standards. Number two, always make sure that your development makes a business case. I think through this conversation, Jean-Marie and Conrad spoke about the use of local materials. And local materials really are a very good starting point because they are able to reduce your embodied carbon in a significant way. They are able to develop the local economy. They are able to, of course, they are readily accessible. So local materials, renewable energy, those are some of the things that you really need to make, to put into perspective when you're coming up with the development. Because when you look at the developments which were able to be certified green locally here in Kenya, most of them really used a lot of local materials, and they also went for renewable energy, and they also employed a lot of circularity within the resources employed. For instance, water recycling into the developments. That's something which is actually very key because it's highly resilient. Very soon, more and more countries will want to be water resilient. And one of the first places to go is to make sure that the water that you use is actually reusable. And that's a form of resilience, and it's coming. So those are some of the things that somebody really needs to put in mind. But I'm just being a bit narrow with my strategies, maybe for consultancy opportunities. But, but what I can say is that that's a starting point, and you can actually build upon that to get more ideas, and always make sure that the bottom line is really good for that particular project. Back to you, Vere.
Awesome, thank you. And Conrad's been sending me some messages that he's now put in the chats as well, just some of the examples that are happening across Francophone Africa. In Senegal, in Cote d'Ivoire, you speaking about Kenya, there's some people from Ghana, Nigeria, so that there are green building councils there too. So really, I think that this movement is going ahead. And thank you, John, for the insight. As always, we don't have enough time, but over now, jumping from, Cote d'Ivoire to Kenya, now jumping to Mauritius, our next guest, and thank you, John, for your input. So our next guest in the next segment, which is looking at experience, is Tony Lee Luen, who is the founder of GBC, which is Green Building Council in Mauritius, and also the partner of Ecosis. I hope I pronounced that right, Tony. If I didn't, you're going to have to correct me. And they also really look at sustainable construction in the context of Mauritius. And the reason why we really wanted to focus on that is to bring this to reality, that, in small island developing states, the climate threat is real. And, it's really looking at what are some of the local actors, what are some of the action that the local actors are doing And what messages do they have for everyone in this room? So I think, Tony, it's great to have you here. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm sorry, I'm a bit in a public place here. It's like a big conference room.
Okay.
So yeah, some of my experience, je vais parler en français, but my notes are in English.
I will speak in
C'est vrai que à Maurice, l'impact.
So at Mauritius, the impact of climate change is great. We have floodings, we have heavy rainfall, drought, and it doesn't rain in places where it used to rain before. There's erosion of our coastline. Many things are happening due to climate change. And we have people who were killed actually during some floodings recently. So we need to have strong rules and regulations. We have new mechanisms. So these new mechanisms or devices from the Authority National Risk Disaster, but still there's also a Climate Change Act that was promoted also at the interministerial level. There are some committees, so much is happening to counter this impact. Coming back to the construction sector, things are happening. Unfortunately, it's not just because of climate change, but because of marketing and business on the business side, but also with the green funding. I'm working for the AFD at the moment. I'm looking at the criteria for accessing green loan and green finances. This is very interesting because they are probably going to apply this in other countries. It's very difficult to define or decide on the criteria for access to green funding. Anyway, coming back to what's happening, I'm still optimistic, however. The government is making some efforts, but on the other hand, we do have some areas of concerns. There are some laws and bills for the last 12 years going in that direction, but which have not yet been indicted. So we have new specifications, as John was saying, which are very old for public buildings. This was in 2015, but still this has not yet been fully implemented. So much is going on still for change. There's also a lot more demands and requests. So I'm still optimistic when it comes to green funding. We have a campaign at the moment to access a green fund, climate fund at Mauritius. There is money, much money, so we will be able to do things. Every time we build sustainable buildings, people say it costs a lot more money and so on, but that is not yet truly accepted by people. So in a nutshell, this is what we're working on. We also have roadmaps from the Ministry of Environment. They are developing new studies, new requirements for the developers, project developers. There are also some tax advantages that are being implemented to encourage these projects, which are the smart cities. For smart cities, there are quite a few things. But thankfully, the sustainable building and construction field has become more mainstream. Unlike 15 years ago, when no one really understood what we were talking about, it's become more popular. So I think there is a movement. It's become almost like the norm now for people. But in the private sector, I'm not seeing quite the same trend. It's not so much their concern. They're not so concerned about that. They're more concerned by the business aspect, which is a shame. Still, we have the supply chain and value chain from the customer that is developed. This is what I can say. Things are changing, I would say slowly, but still it's going in the right direction still.
And that's so helpful to know, what's happening on the ground, like what you said. There are codes, there is finance, there's the Green Climate Fund, there are projects that are happening in a sense, and more than that, there's an urgency. Like there actually is a need that when we are going to build, we need to build sustainably, not only because it makes business sense, like what John said, but also because it helps with resilience, it helps with adaptation. It really aligns with the directions that we need to go in. So I think my last question before I hand right back over to Chloe, and the session went so fast. And if there are any questions, please do put them in the chat for everyone who's in the session. My question to you would be, you've spoken a bit about it, but maybe if you can tell us from some of the work that you're currently doing as part of Ecosis, how is adaptation and resilience being integrated into some of the policies on the island, and especially ones regarding building and construction? So if you can speak a little bit more around adaptation and resilience within the context of loss and damage.
Yeah, I think it's very important, and that's into public policies also, because like there's been people dying in flash floods. Pardon, je parle en français. Dans les inondations, etc.
As I said, there were people who died in floodings. So we recognize and we identify what are the risks, climate risks and hazards. So much is happening, much is being done. There are more strict laws, for example. You cannot, when it comes to a building on mountains, and etc. We're working with the government. We are working on policies, including building. And we are now looking at doing more green buildings. And things are starting to change, but they do not have so much resources, so it's a bit hard for them. It's difficult to do things differently. It's not that easy. For example, the Committee for Climate Change and the representatives of the ministries, etc., includes. I'm running out of battery, unfortunately. So give me a second.
No problem. No, I think that's fine. I think you kind of closed it all, and it's actually time up as well. But thank you so much, Tony, for that. And I think, before I hand over to Chloe, just to kind of summarize what everyone has said, and thank you to every single one of our speakers. Jean-Marie started us off by saying that there is activity happening when it comes to sustainable buildings and construction, or bâtiment construction to have. And there are activities happening across our continent. And we kind of did go across our continent. We went from Côte d'Ivoire, where Conrad said that there is finance that is available if you have to actually design sustainably, use local materials, approach some of the financial institutions that have green finance available. And then we went over to Kenya with John, who spoke about some of the projects and some of the tips on how to be able to access some of this finance. And then we went to Tony and Mauritius, where the reality of climate change is there, where sustainable construction is not just because it makes business sense or because there's finance, but because there is an urgency when it comes to small island developing states, and how they have adaptation and resilience to climate change. And Tony, I know your battery's back, so you're just in time for the group photo. And so I'll hand over to Chloe, and thank you very much. As the World Green Building Council, we're very, very honored to be working with Climate Chance on this particular topic. And we have green building councils across our continent, and we would love to continue these conversations. So thank you so much, Eva and Chloe, for collaborating with us on this amazing eMag. Over to you, Chloe.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, comme Vere a commencé à le dire, on va prendre un petit moment.
Indeed, there isn't too much time left. We want to take a group photo now. So if you can turn on all of your cameras, turn on your cameras, please, so we can take a group photos. If we could have a little more cameras, that would be good. Let's take a group photo, please.
And it's always so nice to see everyone's faces behind the screen. So this is great.
J'en ai une bonne. On est bon. Merci beaucoup. Merci à vous. Ouais. Ah, on en refait une.
Okay, let's do one more time. Let's do it again one more time. Okay, we have more people with their cameras on. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think that's it. You will see the photo. Thank you to all of our speakers, to all of our participants, to our interpreter who was with us today. For your information, you will find in the eMag version, which will be published on our website, but you will also receive it by email, a passage or an article regarding the next report on building and sustainable building and construction. They were not able to be with us here today. This is another partner, but you will see their written version. And we can meet again during our next Africa Summit, which will take place during the Sustainable Mobility and Climate Week in Dakar in October, between October 3rd and 6th of 2022. And we are expecting many of you to join us. Thank you again for being here with us today. I think we can call it a day, but do not hesitate to contact us by email if you have more questions to ask. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.